Adeline thought her story would end on that mountain road. Left alone at 74 with nothing but a worn suitcase and her grandmother's brass compass, the September wind cutting cold through the pines, and not a single soul in sight. She had walked for nearly 30 minutes before the trail curved and she saw it, the entrance to an old mine shaft, half hidden by decades of overgrowth, its timber frame still standing. She pushed inside to escape the cold, and what she found in that darkness made her sink to her knees. Her own face, carved in wood, shaped in clay, pressed into plaster, hundreds of times, every age, every season, every version of herself she had ever been, preserved by hands she could not yet name. She had no idea who had built this place. She had no idea what it meant. But the answer, when it came, would change everything she thought she knew about her own past, and bring down the man who had stolen her future. If you believe that some loves refuse to be buried, that the truest things survive even the longest silence, hit that subscribe button right now. Every week on this channel, we tell the stories that prove it. Now, let's begin. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Adeline Foss had lived in the house on Garnet Ridge for 46 years, which meant she had lived there longer than the Douglas firs lining the eastern slope had been tall enough to cast shade, longer than the town of Creston Falls, Montana had had its current fire station, and longer than any of her neighbors had stayed anywhere. She had arrived as a bride of 28 on a September morning, when the mountain air already carried the first suggestion of winter in it, and the house had looked to a woman who had grown up in a small rented apartment in Billings like something she had not known was available to real people living real lives. The house had been in the Foss family for 2 generations. Bernard's father had built it in the late 1940s with the earnings of a timber operation that had done well enough to leave something lasting behind, and the mark he had chosen was a house of 11 rooms set into the side of Thornback Ridge, with wide plank pine floors, stone hearths in 4 of the rooms, and a wraparound porch that caught the morning light off the mountains in a way that changed depending on the season and was never quite the same twice. It was not the largest property in Creston Falls, it was the most cared for. Bernard had understood this distinction and had treated the house accordingly, and Adeline had loved it the way you love something given to you before you fully understood its worth, with a gratitude that deepened over the decades into something quieter and more permanent, a love that did not need to announce itself because it had become simply part of who she was. She had been worthy of it. She had managed its household through 46 years of mountain seasons, through the particular challenges of a property at elevation where winter arrived early and stayed long, and the practical demands of keeping a large house functional required both knowledge and a kind of stubborn affection for the work itself. She had raised Bernard's daughter from his first marriage, a girl named Sylvie who had arrived in Adeline's life at age 7, guarded and watchful in the way of children who have already learned that new people do not always stay. Adeline had stayed. She had watched Sylvie grow from that careful, self-contained child into a woman who called every Sunday without fail and who had driven 11 hours from Portland the week Bernard died without being asked. She had opened the house to the community in the way that a house of its size and position in a small mountain town owes to the place it occupies, the charity fundraisers and the holiday gatherings and the quiet, practical hospitality of a woman who understood that generosity was not a performance but a habit. The people of Creston Falls had understood the difference. It had taken years for them to understand it fully, and Adeline had not rushed them. She had simply continued. She had kept the house the way Bernard's mother had arranged it, the garden of hardy mountain perennials along the south-facing slope, the kitchen herb beds, the stone pathway Bernard's father had laid by hand, and she had added to it over the years in the way of someone who intends to remain. The additions of a woman who understood that permanence is not given but built, slowly, one season at a time. Bernard had died 2 years ago. This was the fact beneath all the other facts, the loss that everything since had organized itself around. He had died in the bedroom where his father had died before him, in the particular way of men who are entirely at home in a place, quietly, without theater, at 77 years old, having had the kind of life that does not require a dramatic ending. Adeline had been holding his hand. She had been doing so, in one way or another, for 46 years, and she held it at the end. What followed was not quiet. Bernard's son from his first marriage, Clifton Foss, was 51 years old and had spent his adult life in Missoula doing the kind of commercial real estate work that required a talent for reading situations and a flexible relationship with sentiment. He had arrived for the funeral in a good coat with an attorney beside him and had departed 4 days later with a set of documents that he explained to Adeline were necessary for the orderly administration of Bernard's estate. She had signed them. She had been in the particular condition of grief that makes paperwork feel like an intrusion from a world that has not yet registered what has happened. She had signed what was placed in front of her the way you sign things when you are present in body but not in mind. She had not read them with the attention she would ordinarily have brought to them. Under normal circumstances, Adeline was a woman who read documents carefully. She had managed the household finances for 46 years, had handled the correspondence and the accounts with the methodical precision of someone who understands that the details are where the truth lives. But the weeks after Bernard's death had not been normal circumstances. Clifton had known this. The timing had not been accidental. The understanding of what she had signed came slowly, over the months that followed, as Clifton became more involved in the estate's administration and her own access to its affairs grew steadily narrower. A new attorney began handling matters that had always been handled by the family's longtime lawyer in Creston Falls, a man named Howard Pell who had retired the previous spring, whose replacement had been, she would discover, someone Clifton had selected. Correspondence arrived carrying language that grew more specific with each letter about the terms of Bernard's estate and Adeline's position within it. By the time she understood clearly what had been done, the legal process was already well advanced. The documents she had signed had contained, buried in the standard language of estate administration, a transfer of property rights that effectively removed her standing as primary resident and co-owner of the house on Garnet Ridge. Clifton had not falsified anything. He had been more careful than that. He had presented documents to a grieving widow at the precise moment her judgment was most compromised, and the documents had been exactly what they appeared to be on the surface. She had fought it with everything she had, which turned out to be more than Clifton had anticipated. She had found her own attorney, a woman named Josephine Crew, recommended by the minister of her church, who had known Adeline for over 2 decades and who had said quietly, when she called, that if she needed someone who would not be worn down by complexity or expense, he knew exactly the right person. Josephine Crew had reviewed the documents with the focused attention of someone who had seen this particular kind of maneuvering before and had said, in the careful language of a professional who does not make promises she cannot keep, that the case had real merit and that cases with real merit, given enough time, tended to find their way to just conclusions. The time ran out on a Thursday morning in September. Clifton arrived at 9 in the morning with 2 men she did not recognize and a locksmith, and the expression of a man who has been waiting for a specific day for a long time and has finally arrived at it. He was not unkind in his manner. He had apparently decided that composure was more appropriate than cruelty, which Adeline recognized immediately as a form of calculation more deliberate than anger would have been. He told her she had 2 hours. He told her a car was waiting. He told her that arrangements had been made for her care at a facility in Missoula that he described as comfortable and well regarded, and that he believed would suit her needs very well. She packed what 2 hours allowed, which was less than a person requires and more than she had expected herself to manage in that condition. Clifton's men moved through the rooms with the systematic efficiency of people performing a catalogued inventory, and she moved through them too, but differently, the way you move through a place you are memorizing because you understand you are leaving it. She packed the photographs from the bedroom dresser. She packed the wool blanket her mother had made the winter Adeline was born, the one that had been on every bed she had ever slept in. She packed Bernard's pocket watch, the one his father had given him, which she had found on the nightstand the morning after he died, and had not been able to put in a drawer since. She packed the brass compass that had been her grandmother's, the one she had worn on a cord around her neck every day for as long as she could remember, the one engraved on its inside cover in her grandmother's careful hand, with the words she had pressed into Adeline's palm when Adeline was 11 years old. Find your direction. She had carried those 3 words for 63 years. She did not pack the stone pathway. She could not pack the mountain perennials along the south slope. She stood on the wraparound porch for a moment and looked at the eastern ridge where the Douglas firs had grown tall enough over 46 years to catch the first light in the mornings, and she understood that some things could not be carried and had to be left, and then she left them. The car was a dark blue sedan that Clifton drove himself. She sat in the back with her suitcase and her small bag, and the brass compass in her hand. She watched Creston Falls pass outside the window, the post office, the church where she had sat in the same pew for 46 years, the hardware store where Bernard had spent more Saturday mornings than she could count, and she felt herself passing through it the way you pass through places in the particular unreality of dreams, present in body but at a distance from the fact of it. Clifton drove south from Creston Falls, then west, then onto roads that grew less familiar with each mile, the highway giving way to a two-lane state route, and the state route giving way to a gravel road that passed through country she did not recognize, dry scrub pine and open meadow, the land flattening slightly as Thornback Ridge fell behind them, the particular emptiness of mountain country that is not on the way to anywhere in particular. She asked where they were going. Clifton said they were nearly there. He turned onto a track through the trees that was barely a road at all, drove perhaps half a mile, and stopped the car. He got out. He opened her door. He set her suitcase on the ground beside the track, and her small bag beside the suitcase. He got back into the car and drove away without speaking. She stood on the track and watched the car until the trees swallowed it, and the sound of the engine faded into the wind in the pines, and then she stood a while longer in the September cold, with the silence of that particular Montana country settling around her. Not an empty silence, but a full one. The sound of the forest going about its business without reference to her situation. She was 74 years old. She was standing on an unmarked track in a part of Montana she could not identify, with one suitcase, a small bag, and a brass compass. She picked up the suitcase. She picked up the bag. She began to walk. She walked in the direction the compass told her was north, because north was the direction of Creston Falls, and Creston Falls was the only point on the map she was certain of. The track wound through the pines without any obvious urgency, and she followed it rather than leaving it, understanding that leaving a known path in unfamiliar country was the kind of decision that turned one problem into several. The September cold was serious. She had lived in Montana for 46 years and knew mountain September the way you know a neighbor, reliably, without illusion. Knowing it, and standing in it at 74 years old without shelter or water or any certainty about what lay ahead were different things entirely. She walked steadily, with the pace of someone who has made a decision and is not revisiting it. She held the brass compass in her left hand and felt the weight of it, real, solid, hers. Find your direction, she found it. She kept walking. The mine shaft appeared around a bend in the track, set back from the path behind a stand of old-growth pines, whose roots had lifted the ground around them into long, slow ridges. She almost missed it. The entrance was framed by timber posts that had weathered to the color of the surrounding rock, and the undergrowth of the past several decades had done its patient work of reclamation, threading vine and scrub brush through the framework until the whole structure seemed less built than grown. But the posts were still standing. The crossbeam above the entrance was intact, and someone had cleared the ground in front of it recently enough that the cleared earth had not yet filled back in with pine needles and forest debris. She stopped at the entrance and looked at it for a moment. The wind off Thornback Ridge was coming steadily now, with the particular edge that September wind in Montana carries as a reminder of what is coming, and the trees were moving in it in the slow, collective way of large things that have learned to accommodate the forces working on them. She was cold. The entrance was out of the wind. These were the two facts that mattered most immediately, and she acted on them. She pushed aside the heavy canvas tarp that hung across the entrance. Also recently hung, she noticed, the grommets clean, the cord unknotted, the material not yet stiffened by weather, and stepped inside. The shaft opened almost immediately into a space that was not what she had expected. She had expected a tunnel, narrow, low, dark in the way of things underground. What she found instead was a chamber, perhaps 20 feet across and 15 feet deep, where the original miners had followed a wide seam of ore and opened the mountain into something that more resembled a room than a passageway. The ceiling was low but not oppressively so. The floor had been leveled and fitted with wide wooden boards. Along one wall, someone had built shelves from the same weathered timber as the entrance posts. Along another, a workbench ran the full length of the space, its surface organized with the quiet order of someone who works in a place daily and returns everything to its position when they are finished. There was a battery lantern on the workbench. She found it by feel, switching it on with hands that had gone stiff in the cold, and the chamber filled with a warm, steady light. She turned around, and she stopped. Every surface of the chamber that was not a shelf or a workbench was covered. Not covered in the way of a gallery, spaced, considered, arranged for viewing, but covered in the way of a life, the way a person fills a space they have occupied for a long time without standing back to assess the effect. Carved wooden faces mounted on the rock walls, clay portraits set on the shelves between books and jars of tools, plaster reliefs fixed with careful brackets to the timber framing, pencil drawings sealed in simple frames made from split cedar, relief carvings on pieces of pine board, some no bigger than a sheet of paper, some spanning several feet across. Every face was hers. She was there at what appeared to be 20 or so, her hair long the way she had worn it before she cut it, her expression carrying the particular openness of a person who has not yet had reason to close themselves off. She was there in her 30s, laughing, her head turned at the angle she recognized from photographs as the way she laughed at something that genuinely surprised her. She was there in profile. She could tell it was her 40s from the particular set of her jaw that she had not noticed developing until it was already established, reading something, her shoulders carrying the specific posture of a woman entirely absorbed. She was there in what must have been her 60s, standing in what she recognized, with a sudden tightening in her chest, as the garden along the south slope of Garnet Ridge, her back to the artist, her hands in the mountain perennials. She was there hundreds of times, every age, every season, every version of herself she could remember, and some she could not, preserved in wood and clay and plaster and graphite, by hands she could not yet name. The suitcase dropped from her grip, without her deciding to drop it. She walked forward into the center of the chamber and turned slowly, taking in the full circumference of it, the way the lantern light moved across the carved surfaces and gave them the particular animation of faces caught in the moment just before expression. And she began to weep, not from fear, not from confusion, not from the cold or the exhaustion or the long wait of the day, but from something that did not have a name she could find quickly, the shock of being seen completely and continuously by someone whose name she did not yet know, of understanding that someone had spent an enormous portion of their life holding her in careful attention, of standing inside the accumulated evidence of a love she had not known was there. She was still standing in the center of the chamber, her face wet, the lantern casting its steady light across hundreds of versions of her own face, when she heard footsteps on the cleared ground outside. The canvas top moved. The cold came in with it, a brief rush of September air that made the lantern flicker once before settling. And then the man stepped through, and he stopped when he saw her. And the expression that crossed his face was one she would spend a long time afterward trying to find the right word for. Not surprise exactly, because surprise was too simple and too brief for what she saw, but something closer to the experience of receiving something you had quietly, privately, stopped permitting yourself to believe was still possible. He was, she would think later, exactly what she might have imagined him becoming if she had ever been permitted to imagine it. She had not allowed herself that exercise in the 52 years since, had kept the door to that particular room closed with the firm and deliberate discipline of someone who understands that some doors, once opened, are very difficult to close again. The boy she had known at 22 had been lean and careful in his movements, with the particular economy of someone who had grown up working with his hands and learned early to make every motion count. The man standing in the entrance of the chamber was 76 years old and had that same quality, the same deliberateness, the same quiet attention in his eyes, the same sense of a person who does not spend themselves carelessly. His hair was white. His hands were large and marked by decades of work. His eyes were exactly as she remembered them. Adeline, he said, just her name, after 52 years. She had believed he was dead. This was the fact she had carried for more than half a century without examining it directly, because examining it directly had never been something she could afford to do and continue functioning. Theodore Brandt had been the son of the man who maintained the grounds and outbuildings of her parents' property in Billings, had been part of the landscape of her growing up in the way that certain people become part of a landscape, present so consistently that their presence becomes a kind of permanence you do not think to question. She had known him since she was 14. She had understood at 22 that what she felt for him was not the comfortable familiarity of long acquaintance, but something of an entirely different order. Her father had told her that summer in the sitting room of the Billings house, with the particular steadiness of a man who believes absolutely in his own judgment, that Theodore had been in an accident on one of the mountain roads north of the city, that he was gone, that it was a tragedy, and she should pray for his family, and she should also understand that the attachment had been an unsuitable one, and that it was time to think clearly about her future. She had believed him. She had been 22 and had not yet accumulated the experience necessary to conceive of her father looking at her steadily and telling her something that was not true. The alternative, that he had looked at her with that steady voice and that calm expression and told her that the person she loved was dead when that person was alive and had simply been removed from the situation, was not a thought her mind had been capable of forming at 22. She had grieved. She had, over the 3 years that followed, made her way back to something that functioned like ordinary life. She had met Bernard Foss at a community gathering in Billings when she was 25, and she had loved him, genuinely, fully, in the committed way of someone who has decided to love what life has offered and has carried that decision through without reservation for 46 years. Bernard had been a good man. Their life had been a good life. She held this truth without qualification because it was true. And Theodore Brandt had been alive the entire time. He told her the rest of it the way you tell things that have been held for a very long time and must be released with care. Sitting across from her in the lantern-lit chamber with the carved faces of her watching from every surface, the September wind moving through the pines outside, one piece at a time, each piece given its own space before the next arrived. Her father had not told him she was dead. He had done something more precise than that. He had offered Theodore money and the clear understanding that remaining in Billings or anywhere within the reach of the Calloway family's considerable network of acquaintances was not a viable option. Theodore had been 23. He had taken the money because he had no other resources and no clear alternative. He had left Billings that week in a borrowed truck with everything he owned and had driven north and then west, through Idaho and into Montana, until he reached country remote enough that the distance felt like something more than geography. He had ended up in Creston Falls. He had not known this at first, had not known that the woman he had loved at 22 and had never found a reason to stop loving would arrive 30 years later and build a life in the same small mountain town. He had discovered it by accident one afternoon at the hardware store, 7 years after settling in Creston Falls, when he had turned an aisle and seen her, older but entirely recognizable, her posture exactly as he remembered it, and had walked quickly out of the store and sat in his truck for a long time with his hands on the steering wheel before he trusted himself to drive. He had not spoken to her. He had understood in those first moments in the truck that speaking to her was not something he could do without consequences. He had no right to impose on her life. She was married. She was settled. She had built something real and lasting in Creston Falls, and he had seen it in the way she moved through the hardware store with the ease of someone entirely at home in a place, the particular comfort of a person who belongs somewhere without needing to announce it. He had no claim on any of that. He had never had a claim on it. What her father had done had not given him a claim. It had only given him a loss, and losses, he had learned over 52 years, were not the same thing as entitlements. So he had stayed. He had kept his distance with the careful discipline of someone who has drawn a boundary for good reasons and intends to hold it. He had continued his work, the wood carving and the stonework and the leatherwork that had been his primary trade since leaving Billings, the craft he had taught himself over years the way he taught himself everything, methodically and without impatience, improving in small increments that accumulated over decades into something that other people recognized as mastery, even when he did not think of it in those terms himself. He sold pieces through a small cooperative in Missoula under a name that was not quite his own, T. Brand, which was close enough to be honest and different enough to be private, and he had carved what he remembered. He said this simply, without dramatizing it and without apology. He had carved what he had never stopped remembering, the face of someone he had loved at 22 and had not found a reason to replace with anyone or anything else. He had done it the way you do things that are entirely private. Not for an audience, not for validation, not even for himself exactly, but because the alternative was to let it go, and letting it go had never been something he could bring himself to do completely. The chamber had been the mine shaft on the 40 acres he had purchased 15 years ago, when land in this part of Montana was still within the reach of a man of his means. He had cleared it and fitted it and made it his studio, the place where the private work happened, separate from the workshop in his house where the commissioned pieces were made, separate from the cooperative's records, separate from everything that had a public face. It was his alone. He had never shown it to anyone. He had never intended to show it to anyone. He had certainly never imagined that the woman whose face covered its walls would one day walk through its entrance. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Adeline sat with all of it in the lantern light, in the particular stillness of someone absorbing information that does not merely add to what they know, but reorganizes the entire structure of it. She was 74 years old, and she had believed this man was dead for 52 years, and he was sitting across from her in a chamber he had built with his own hands, telling her that he had never stopped. Not completely, not in the way that counted. She held the brass compass. "My father told me you were gone," she said. "I know," Theodore said. "I worked that out eventually. It took me a long time, but I got there." "I would have come," she said, "if I had known." "I know," he said. "I believe that. I believed it once I had enough distance to think clearly. I should have found a way to reach you. I thought about it. I thought about it for years." She looked at the wall nearest her. A row of carved cedar panels, each perhaps 8 inches square, each containing her face at a different age, arranged in sequence from left to right, the way a careful person arranges things they intend to return to. She reached out and touched the edge of one without touching the carving itself. She was, she estimated, about 35 in it. She had been happy at 35. She had not known she was being seen. "How did you manage it?" she said. "From a distance," he said. He said it without embarrassment, with the directness of a man who has had 52 years to make peace with the particular shape his love had taken. "I would see you sometimes in town, at the market, at the church, in the garden sometimes when I drove the Ridge Road. I never let you see me. I just needed to know you were there, that you were all right." She looked at another panel. She was older in this one. She could see it in the set of her shoulders, the particular way she was holding her head. She was in the garden on Garnet Ridge, half-turned, the mountain perennials around her knees. She remembered that afternoon without being able to say why. A Tuesday in late September, the light going golden on the ridge, the particular smell of the garden at the end of its season. She had thought she was entirely alone. "I had no idea," she said. "I know," he said. "That was the point." He paused. "It was also," he said quietly, "the thing I am least proud of. You deserved to know you were being seen. You deserved to know someone was holding all of it. I told myself I was protecting you from a complication you had not asked for. I think mostly I was protecting myself from a conversation I did not know how to begin." She looked at him across the lantern light in the chamber full of her own faces. He met her gaze with the steadiness of someone who has decided that honesty, at this point, is the only thing left worth offering. She reached up and opened the brass compass in her palm. The needle settled, as it always did, pointing north toward Creston Falls. She thought about her grandmother pressing it into her hands when she was 11 years old. She thought about the words engraved inside its cover. She thought about the mountain road and the suitcase and the cold and the 30 minutes she had walked before the trail curved and brought her here. She thought about the particular randomness of it, the specific combination of Clifton's cruelty and her own tired feet and the September wind that had pushed her toward the entrance of this shaft rather than past it. She did not think it was random. She was not certain what she thought it was. But she did not think it was random. "Tell me the rest of it," she said. "All of it. From the beginning." He nodded. He got up, and she noticed he moved carefully. The movement of a man whose body has accumulated its history in the specific way of people who have done physical work for 5 decades. And he went to a shelf and returned with a thermos and 2 enamel cups, the kind of preparation that said he had been coming to this chamber for a long time and had long since made it comfortable for extended stays. He poured. The tea was strong and very hot, and she accepted it with both hands. He sat back down across from her, and he told her. He had arrived in Creston Falls in the winter of 1987 with a truck that was not his own, a toolbox that was, and enough money to rent a room above the hardware store for 3 months while he found work. The work had not been difficult to find. A man who could build and repair and restore things with his hands, who showed up when he said he would and did not require supervision, was not a difficult proposition to sell in a small Montana mountain town where the winters were hard and the list of things needing attention was always longer than the list of people capable of attending to them. He had worked for a contractor first, then independently, then with the kind of quiet local reputation that does not advertise itself but accumulates steadily over years until it becomes simply part of the town's understanding of itself. He had bought the 40 acres 12 years after arriving, when he had saved enough, and when the land came available through the estate of an old rancher who had no heirs interested in holding it. The mine shaft had been the reason. He had walked the property the first time with the rancher's son, a man his own age, who wanted the whole thing resolved quickly and cleanly, and when he had found the chamber, the wide seam the original miners had followed into the mountain, the timber framing still sound, the space dry and protected and possessed of a quality of silence he had never encountered anywhere else, he had known immediately what it was for. He had spent the first 2 years simply making it right, fitting the floor, reinforcing the framing, installing the ventilation that made long hours inside it possible, fitting the shelves and the workbench and running the cable for the battery system that powered the lantern. He had done all of it himself, working on weekends and on the long evenings of the Montana summer when the light lasted past 9 and there was no reason to stop. He had told no one what he was building. The people of Creston Falls knew him as a craftsman who kept his private life private, and they had respected this in the way that small communities sometimes respect privacy more completely than large ones, understanding that it is a choice rather than an eccentricity. The carving had begun before the chamber was finished. He had always carved. It had been the first craft he had taught himself in the years after leaving Billings, working from books and from the patient observation of other people's work, developing through repetition and failure and more repetition the particular sensitivity of hand that makes the difference between competent carving and something that is genuinely alive. He had carved landscapes and animals and the faces of people he encountered in his life, and he had carved her face, from memory because it was the face that was most completely present in him, and the carving was a way of being honest about that fact, in a space where honesty had no consequences for anyone but himself. The first pieces he had made of her were rough. Memory is an imperfect reference, and the memory of a face you have not seen for years degrades in specific ways. The proportions drift, the particular quality of an expression becomes generalized, the details that make a face itself rather than merely a face blur at the edges. He had worked at it anyway, understanding that imperfect fidelity was better than nothing, that the act of trying to hold her accurately in his hands was itself something worth doing. Then he had seen her at the hardware store, and everything had changed. He had not carved from imagination after that. He had worked from observation, from the glimpses of her that Creston Falls afforded him over the following years, at the market, at the church, in the garden visible from the ridge road on clear mornings when the light was right. He had a craftsman's eye and a craftsman's memory for what his eye recorded, and he had trained both over decades to the point where a single careful observation could sustain weeks of work. He had never sketched her publicly, never taken photographs, never done anything that would have been visible or recognizable as what it was. He had looked, with the focused attention of someone storing something valuable, and then he had gone to the chamber and worked with what he had stored. The pieces had accumulated over 15 years the way serious work accumulates when a person gives it consistent time and full attention, slowly at first, then with increasing confidence, then with the particular fluency of someone working inside a subject they understand completely. He had developed techniques specific to the work. He had learned to carve emotional states rather than merely expressions, to find in the grain of the wood or the resistance of the clay the exact quality of a person's interior at a specific moment. He had become, without intending to become it, an artist of a very specific and very private kind. Some of the pieces he had sold, not of her, never of her, but of other subjects, the mountain landscapes and the wildlife and the occasional portrait commissioned by someone in town who trusted his eye. He sold them through the cooperative in Missoula, and the cooperative had, over the years, developed a reputation for the quality of what it carried, and that reputation had slowly and then significantly attached itself to the name T brand, which appeared on the base of pieces that were now in private collections in Missoula and Billings and Helena, and he said this carefully, watching her face, in at least one collection in Seattle whose owner had paid at a cooperative auction 4 years ago an amount that had surprised even the cooperative's director. The piece was a relief carving in pine, a woman standing in a mountain garden, her back to the viewer, her hands in the flowers. It was titled simply Finding North, which was also a phrase with general meaning, and the buyer had assumed it referred to the landscape. Adeline sat with this. Her face had been in Seattle for 4 years, in a collector's home, admired by people who did not know whose face it was or what it meant. She thought about Clifton, who was at this moment presumably back in Missoula, satisfied that the problem of Thursday morning had been efficiently resolved. She thought about Josephine Crew, who had said the case had real merit. She thought about the brass compass in her hand and the needle pointing north toward the town where she had lived for 46 years and which she had just been driven away from in the back of a dark blue sedan. She thought about the specific phrase Theodore had used, a reputation that had grown significantly. She looked at him across the enamel cups and the lantern light. "Do you have a lawyer?" she said. The attorney's name was Harlan Wise, and he arrived at the mineshaft property 2 days after Adeline did, 2 days during which she slept in the spare room of the house Theodore had built on the 40 acres, a low, wide structure of Montana limestone and reclaimed timber that sat on a slight rise above the tree line, with a view of Thornback Ridge that changed character every hour with the light. She had eaten the meals he cooked with the quiet competence of someone who has lived alone for a long time and made a settled peace with his own company. She had walked the property in the mornings when the cold was still sharp and the frost was still on the north-facing slopes, learning its particular geography, the way the land dropped toward the creek on the western edge, the stand of old-growth pines around the mineshaft entrance, the meadow on the south side where the light collected in the middle of the day and held for several hours in a way that made the grass look lit from beneath. She had gone back to the chamber on the second morning alone and walked through it with the specific attention of someone conducting an inventory of something important. She had looked at every piece with the unhurried care of a woman who has managed complex households for 46 years and understands that thorough examination is not optional when the stakes are real. She had looked at the early pieces, rougher, the proportions slightly uncertain, and at the later ones, where the confidence of a craftsman fully inside his subject was evident in every surface. She had found in the far corner of the chamber, on a low shelf separate from the others, a small carving that was not of her alone. It was a relief panel in pale birchwood, perhaps 12 inches across, depicting 2 young people sitting on a stone garden wall in the late afternoon light of what she recognized, with a sensation like a door opening in a room she had kept closed for 52 years, as the wall at the back of her parents' property in Billings. She was 22 in it, he was 23. Their postures were the postures of people entirely at ease in each other's presence. She had not known anyone had seen that afternoon. She had not known anyone had held it carefully enough to carve it from memory half a century later. She stood in front of it for a long time. Then she went to find Theodore. Harlan Wise arrived in a truck with good tires and the boots of someone who spent regular time in mountain country, and he had the unhurried manner of a man who has handled complicated legal situations long enough to understand that rushing them produces worse outcomes than patience. He was perhaps 65, with the careful eyes of someone who listens more than he speaks and speaks precisely when he does. He listened to Adeline's full account of the documents, the estate process, Clifton, and the Thursday morning on the mountain track without interrupting. He listened to Theodore's account of his resources and his professional standing. Then he was quiet for a moment in the particular way of someone organizing information into its correct sequence before proceeding. He asked for every document Adeline had retained. She had retained more than Clifton had anticipated or intended. In the 2 hours she had been given to pack on Thursday morning, she had had the presence of mind, the specific presence of mind of a woman who had managed a household's complete financial and administrative reality for 46 years and understood instinctively that documents are the difference between a case and a story, to go to the desk in Bernard's study and take the accordion folder she had been keeping since the estate process began, the one that contained her copies of every letter, every filing, every piece of correspondence that had arrived since Clifton's attorney had entered the picture. She had put it in her small bag alongside the wool blanket and Bernard's pocket watch and the brass compass. It was now on Harlan Wise's lap. He read for 45 minutes without speaking. When he finished, he set the papers down and looked at Adeline with the expression of a man who has found what he was looking for before he was certain it would be there. "There is a will," he said. It was not a question. "Josephine Crew believed there might be," Adeline said, "but we could not locate it before the timeline closed." "There is a will," Harlan said again, more quietly. He lifted a document. "This administrative reference here, this cites a filing number that does not correspond to the will submitted for probate. The numbers are sequential in the estate record, but they do not match the document that was actually filed, which means there are 2 documents, which means one of them was not submitted." He set the paper down carefully. "It means," he said, "that Clifton Foss may have built his entire case on an instrument that is not the controlling document." He looked at Adeline steadily. "It means we have a real problem to solve, and I believe we can solve it." Adeline looked at Theodore. Theodore looked at Adeline. The lantern in the corner of the room cast its steady light across the carved faces on the walls. Outside, the wind moved through the pines on Thornback Ridge with the sound of something patient and permanent. "Where do we begin?" Adeline said. "We begin," Harlan said, "by making a phone call to Bernard's original attorney, the one who retired. Because if my reading of this document is correct, that man has been waiting for exactly this call." Howard Pell was 79 years old and had practiced law in Creston Falls for 41 years before retiring, and when Harlan Wise reached him by telephone the morning after his first visit to the property, the old attorney answered on the second ring and listened without interrupting. He said, without preamble, that he had prepared a will for Bernard Foss in the final year of Bernard's life, that he had retained a copy in his personal files, that the will he had prepared had not been the one submitted for probate. He had not come forward. He said this with the careful honesty of a man conducting a final accounting of a long career, because he had not been entirely certain that coming forward was his proper role. He had told himself this at intervals over the preceding 2 years and had not fully believed it on any of those occasions. He said he was relieved to be called. He said he would have everything ready within the hour. The will Howard Pell had prepared left the Garnet Ridge property entirely to Adeline, with a separate financial arrangement for Clifton that Bernard had structured with the specific intention of being fair without being ambiguous. It was clearly and unambiguously different from the document Clifton had submitted for probate, in ways that Harlan described to Adeline and Theodore the following morning with the focused clarity of someone making complicated things quickly legible. Harlan filed the document with the probate court on a Monday, accompanied by a detailed affidavit from Howard Pell and a formal complaint regarding the conduct of Clifton's attorney. He also called the Granite County Sheriff's Office, where a deputy listened to his account of the Thursday morning on the mountain track. A 74-year-old woman, September cold, an unmarked trail, no water, no transportation, with the expression of someone whose job had just become unusually straightforward. Clifton Foss was arrested on a Wednesday, charged with fraud, financial elder abuse, and criminal abandonment of a vulnerable adult. The case that followed was not short, but its direction was apparent from the first week, and Clifton understood this with the clarity of a man who has made a large and irreversible miscalculation. Adeline was not present for the arrest. She was in the chamber watching Theodore work, asking him questions about the grain of the Douglas fir plank before him, and he was answering with the complete patience of someone who does not experience explaining what he loves as any kind of imposition. She had spent 46 years managing a large household and had done it well and willingly. But she had not spent those years doing something that lived entirely in her own hands. Watching Theodore work had introduced her to what that might feel like. She was 74 years old, and she had learned enough to know that was not a reason to stop discovering things. The legal resolution took 8 months. By the following May, the Garnet Ridge property had been returned to Adeline's full ownership. She visited the house once, on a Saturday, with Theodore beside her. She walked every room, stood on the wraparound porch, looked at the Douglas firs on the eastern ridge, and went to the garden to find the climbing rose she had planted in 1994. Then she walked out through the front gate, got into the car, and drove back to the 40 acres on Thornback Ridge. The house was a house. She did not need to live inside its history anymore. She listed it the following week and directed the proceeds with precision, a portion into a trust for her own security, the remainder to the Creston Falls Community Library, a trades bursary at the community college, and the beginnings of something not yet formally an organization, but soon to be. The Brant Craft Foundation received its non-profit status in October and opened in the expanded studio with 5 students, young people from Creston Falls and the surrounding mountain communities who were already making things with their hands without resources, instruction, or the knowledge that what they were making had any value beyond their own private relationship with it. Theodore taught. Adeline managed the accounts, the correspondence, the scheduling. They discovered what they perhaps should have known from the beginning, that what each brought to a shared endeavor was precisely what the other lacked. The exhibition opened the following spring in Missoula, titled Finding North, A Portrait in Time. 52 pieces, spanning 52 years, arranged chronologically. At the opening, Adeline stood in the center of the gallery and felt, for the second time, the thing she had felt in the chamber on the September afternoon she first walked through its entrance. Theodore stood beside her, holding her hand, the way he had held it since the day after she arrived, and had not stopped. On a late October evening, she sat on the porch and listened to him working in the studio, held the brass compass, and opened it. The needle settled north. Find your direction. She had found it, not in comfort or certainty, but in motion, on a cold mountain track with one suitcase and no clear destination. Theodore's footsteps crossed the porch and he sat beside her and took her hand, and they watched Thornback Ridge go from gold to amber to the deep blue that this part of Montana produced after sunset, and neither of them said anything, because some things are large enough that words make them smaller, and they had both learned at last to let the large things be large. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.